An HOA president called 911 about my supposedly illegal lakeside cabin, unaware that I am the owner of the dock permits essential for the survival of her $50 million neighborhood. At 6 in the morning, as I savored coffee on my Lake Clearwater dock, a police car appeared, followed by Linda in her designer workout attire, yelling about how my grandfather's 75-year-old cabin was ruining property values. She had already slapped me with $2,500 in baseless fines, misjudging a 30-year electrician's ability to interpret property law. However, my 1947 deed gives me legal authority over every dock in her exclusive community. Furthermore, she has been wrongfully collecting fees for many years. This evening, I intend to revoke every single dock permit and lay bare 3 decades of fraudulent activity before the entire neighborhood. Let me rewind and explain how this entire situation began. I'm Jake Morrison, 52 years old, and until recently, I was simply a retired electrician attempting to rebuild my life following a rather difficult divorce. As you might know, sometimes a project is necessary to occupy your hands while your heart mends. 8 months ago, I inherited my grandfather's fishing cabin on Lake Clearwater in Michigan. This was no luxurious lakefront estate. It was a true 1940s fishing shack, constructed by my grandfather's own hands upon his return from the war. The cabin smelled of cedar shavings and aged varnish, possessed more character than a Hemingway story, and was situated on the most beautiful stretch of shoreline imaginable. My objective was straightforward: restore the cabin during weekends, possibly lease it to anglers, and show my grandson how to cast a line in the same spot where 4 generations of Morrison men had acquired the same skill. It was a simple, uncomplicated plan. That is when I encountered Linda Ashworth. Linda, age 48, operates a perpetually immaculate white Mercedes SUV and serves as the president of an organization known as the Clearwater Shores Premium Community. This is the HOA that emerged around the lake in 1995, filled with sprawling mansions, each valued at $800,000. Linda has a background in real estate, is married to a bank vice president, and possesses a certain kind of smile, the kind that is as sweet as can be until she doesn't get what she wants. The first time we crossed paths, I was on the dock sanding some weathered boards, feeling the familiar smooth river stones under my boots where my grandfather had laid his small path. With the morning sun just touching the water, I was enjoying that perfect tranquility you can only find on a lake at sunrise. Then I heard the distinct click-clack of heels on the dock planks. "Welcome to the neighborhood," Linda sang out, though her eyes were already taking stock of everything she disapproved of about my property. I rose, brushed the sawdust from my hands, and made an effort to be friendly. "Morning, ma'am. It's a beautiful day, isn't it?" "Oh, yes, gorgeous," she replied, before immediately changing the subject. "I'm Linda Ashworth, the HOA president. I wanted to speak with you about elevating your property to meet community standards. I have been around long enough to know when someone is trying to manipulate me." The way she uttered the word property as if it were distasteful. The synthetic smile that never reached her eyes. I realized I was up against a professional. "Well, Linda, I appreciate the concern, but this cabin was constructed in 1947, long before any HOA was established. I retrieved the original building permit from my back pocket, a document I had started carrying after receiving strange looks from some neighbors. Everything is legal and grandfathered in." That was when her facade cracked ever so slightly. "That old shack has no place here anymore. Our community upholds certain standards, and to be blunt, it is diminishing everyone's property values." I maintained a calm and even tone. "Ma'am, I don't believe you fully grasped the situation." She moved closer, and I caught a scent of her high-end perfume mingling with the fresh lake air. "Oh, I grasp it perfectly. You are presented with 2 options. Either bring that cabin up to our community standards, or we will devise a method for its removal. This is a premium neighborhood, Mr. Morrison, and we are determined to maintain it as such." Now, here is the thing about individuals like Linda. They are accustomed to people yielding when they exert their influence. They depend on intimidation and the belief that ordinary individuals cannot stand up to their lawyers, connections, and HOA boards. But what Linda was unaware of was that my grandfather was more than just a fisherman. He was the type of man who scrutinized every contract, retained every receipt, and never discarded a document that might one day prove important. And he impressed upon me that patience and meticulous preparation will always triumph over bluster and threats. "Linda," I said, taking a sip of my coffee while observing a great blue heron hunting in the shallows, "I believe you are about to discover something quite interesting about this old place." Linda wasted no time in acting on her threat. 3 days following our little chat on the dock, I received an unexpected visit from the county building department. I was in the process of installing new cleats on the dock when an inspector arrived, clipboard in hand, wearing a sour look that implied he had already formed an opinion on what he would find. "Jake Morrison, I am here in response to a complaint filed concerning unpermitted structures on this property." The complaint was submitted on official HOA letterhead, signed by Linda herself, asserting that my cabin breached lake setback regulations and featured numerous unpermitted alterations that constituted a hazard to the community. The inspector moved around taking photographs, but curiously, he seemed to focus only on the cabin's rustic exterior, overlooking its solid foundation and the careful restoration work I had been undertaking. This is where Linda committed her first major blunder. You see, when you dedicate 30 years to being an electrician, you pick up a thing or two about permits and inspections. You also learn to keep your paperwork immaculate and your documentation airtight. I went to my truck and retrieved Grandpa's old metal filing box, the same olive green military surplus container he had used to store crucial documents since 1947. The hinges groaned as I opened it, releasing the scent of old paper and decades of memories. "Inspector, before you finalize that report, you might want to review these." I laid out the original survey maps, the 1947 building permits, and correspondence between my grandfather and the county from the time he built the cabin. Every single document was in pristine condition, organized chronologically, and bore official seals. The inspector's demeanor shifted more rapidly than a Michigan weather system. "Sir, your paperwork is actually more organized than what I see for most new constructions." It was then that I brought up something I had observed during my morning coffee sessions on the porch. "You know, Inspector, while you are here verifying setbacks, you might want to measure some of those more recent properties. I believe you will find that several HOA houses have deck extensions that cross their property lines, Linda's included." Her deck, the one where she enjoyed hosting her wine and gossip gatherings, extended a full 3 feet onto what was technically easement property. The inspector added it to his list of violations that very afternoon. Let me pass on something I learned from all those years of pulling permits. Grandfathered properties often possess a stronger legal foundation than more recent developments. Always investigate original permits and surveys before you start making accusations. Linda got her violation notice on the same day that I received my clean inspection report. It turned out that her pristine deck required either a $15,000 engineering assessment or complete demolition to adhere to current setback regulations. The sound of her Mercedes engine struggling in my driveway that evening was nearly as gratifying as the flavor of the base I had caught and cooked for my dinner. But Linda was far from finished. That weekend, my neighbor Earl, a 78-year-old retired machinist who had known my grandfather, came by with a 6-pack of Budweiser and some anecdotes I hadn't heard. "Your granddad was as sharp as they come," Earl commented, making himself comfortable in one of the old Adirondack chairs on my porch. He anticipated that they would eventually try to develop this lake, so he took steps to protect what was important. Meanwhile, Linda was preoccupied with her social media offensive. A Facebook group named Protecting Our Community Standards materialized overnight, featuring unflattering photos of my cabin accompanied by captions about safeguarding property values. She had a talent for framing restoration work as destruction and progress as decay. I did not get involved in any of it. Social media conflicts were not my way of doing things. Besides, I had more significant matters to attend to, like the expanding collection of historical documents I was unearthing each time I sorted through Grandpa's papers. A few of the newer residents began to offer whispered words of support when they saw me at the hardware store, but they were hesitant to speak out in public. I could appreciate their position. No one wants to antagonize the HOA president, particularly when they are still making mortgage payments. But the old-timers, they recalled a different time. They remembered when this lake was a place for fishing, peace, and quiet, before it became about property values and community standards. And they started to voice those memories aloud. Linda's deck violation was only the start. It's funny how regulations can be a double-edged sword, isn't it? When you begin insisting on the strict application of every rule and setback, you sometimes find that those in glass houses shouldn't be throwing stones. The sound of my cordless drill reverberating across the water during those evening dock repairs turned into a form of meditation. Every screw I drove, every board I secured, was another move toward honoring my grandfather's legacy and another strike against Linda's belief that I would simply give in and vanish. But I could sense a storm was brewing. Linda was not the type to back down from a confrontation, especially after being humiliated by her own violation notice. If anything, I had only made her more formidable. Linda's reaction to her deck violation was both swift and expected. She escalated her efforts significantly. Within a week, every member of the HOA got a formal notice regarding an emergency meeting to tackle the issue of non-conforming structures threatening our community. She had managed to get her tennis partner, City Councilman Bradley Walsh, to attend and discuss what she described as urgent property enforcement concerns. The meeting took place at the community center on a Thursday evening, and Linda arrived with a PowerPoint presentation that would have impressed a corporate attorney. She presented charts on property values, displayed photos of my cabin from the least flattering angles imaginable, and proposed a special assessment to engage specialized legal counsel for property enforcement. In simpler terms, she wanted every homeowner to contribute funds so she could hire a lawyer to pursue me. To top it all off, she was passing around a petition that demanded I either demolish the cabin completely or pay a $50,000 compliance fine to align it with what she termed community standards. While Linda was engrossed in her political maneuvers, I was engaged in detective work. The following morning, I went to the county courthouse, that magnificent old brick structure with a musty basement records room that smelled of decades of forgotten documents. I dedicated the better part of 3 days down there, sifting through property records that went as far back as the 1920s, meticulously tracing every deed, easement, and piece of legal paperwork associated with Lake Clearwater. The coffee from the courthouse vending machine tasted like burnt rubber, but I hardly took notice. I was too preoccupied with a discovery that made my hand tremble as I handled the fragile 1940s documents in their protective sleeves. You see, I was aware that Grandpa had sold off the majority of his lakefront property to developers in 1994. What I was not aware of were the precise conditions he had woven into that sale. Concealed within the original easement deed was a clause that altered the entire situation. Grandpa had not just kept access to the dock. He had maintained ownership of the dock structure itself, selling only the rights to use it to the development company. Every single boat slip that HOA members were leasing for $2,000 a month necessitated written authorization from the Morrison family's designated representative. That representative was me. Linda had been unlawfully collecting dock fees for years. I sat there in that basement records room, listening to my footsteps echo on the marble courthouse stairs as I returned to my truck, realizing that I possessed what amounted to a nuclear weapon disguised as yellowed legal documents. However, I am not the kind of person to resort to extreme measures without first giving diplomacy a try. I scheduled a meeting with the HOA's attorney, a well-dressed man in his 50s who likely billed more per hour than I used to earn in a week. I entered his mahogany-paneled office carrying a manila folder and wearing a calm demeanor. "Mr. Morrison, I am aware you are having some disagreements with the HOA board." "Not disagreements, precisely," I stated, sliding the easement deed across his gleaming desk. "More like clarifications." I observed his face turn pale as he reviewed the document. Then he read it a second time. Then he put on his reading glasses and read it a third time. "This is, in fact, ironclad. I am not seeking trouble," I informed him, and I meant it. "I simply wish to restore my cabin in peace. But I believed you should notify Mrs. Ashworth about the dock ownership issue before matters escalate." The attorney nodded slowly, likely calculating billable hours and potential liabilities. I will need to address this with the board immediately. News travels quickly in small communities, especially when it involves lawyers turning pale and making urgent phone calls. Earl visited that evening with information from the Old Timer Network. "The hardware store owner said Linda tried to have you banned from purchasing supplies," he reported with a chuckle, settling into his usual chair on my porch. The marina owner mentioned she's been asserting dock ownership for insurance reasons. The feel of those worn documents in my hands, the scent of old paper and legal ramifications, the sound of Linda's meticulously built world beginning to fracture. It was all culminating into something larger than either of us had anticipated. Linda's initial reaction was complete denial. Some old papers don't supersede modern property law, she declared to anyone who would listen. But in private, according to Earl's intelligence, she was panicking over the potential financial liability for all the dock fees she had been collecting. Here is something I learned about easement rights that every property owner should understand. Easement and usage rights can take precedence over HOA authority. Always review original development agreements before you buy waterfront property. By the week's end, Linda was telling people we would contest this in court if need be. She was doubling down once more, just as I had anticipated. But what she hadn't grasped was that I was only just beginning. And unlike her blustering threats, everything I possessed was supported by decades of diligent documentation and legal precedent. The dock fees were merely the tip of the iceberg. Linda's desperation began to surface, and desperate people tend to make careless errors. Her subsequent action was to assert that my dock repairs were in violation of historical waterfront preservation rules, which was ironic given that her neighborhood had paved over a significant portion of the natural shoreline for their boat slips. She submitted a complaint to the state environmental agency, claiming I was conducting unpermitted lake modifications that endangered the ecosystem. She also mobilized the HOA board to threaten a lawsuit for diminished property values. Although half the board members were beginning to show discomfort with her increasingly hostile methods. And then came the rumors. Linda began to spread whispers about my suspicious daily activities at the cabin. According to the coffee shop gossip mill, I was either conducting some sort of illicit business, concealing assets from my divorce, or, my personal favorite, running a meth lab disguised as a fishing cabin. I handled it the way my grandfather taught me, systematically and with thorough documentation. Every interaction was photographed and time-stamped. Every conversation was recorded on my phone, which is perfectly legal in Michigan as long as one party is aware of the recording. When my tools started to vanish from the cabin under mysterious circumstances, I set up a security camera system that would rival a casino's. The visit from the environmental inspector was set for a Tuesday morning, and I made sure to be present bright and early with fresh coffee and a comprehensive set of environmental permits. Mr. Morrison, I'm here regarding potential wetland violations. Of course, Inspector. Coffee. What Linda had failed to investigate was that my grandfather had actually established a voluntary conservation easement back in 1952, which protected more shoreline than current regulations mandated. The cabin's environmental impact was smaller than that of a typical suburban garage, and every change I had implemented actually enhanced water quality by substituting old materials with eco-friendly ones. Meanwhile, the inspector observed that 3 HOA properties had recently landscaped directly to the water's edge using non-native plants and chemical fertilizers, a blatant breach of current wetland protection laws. Ma'am, the inspector informed Linda when she arrived an hour later, anticipating a victory. Your community is the one with environmental violations, not Mr. Morrison. But the most significant discovery came from my security cameras. The initial footage captured Linda's teenage son spray painting "Go Home" on the side of my cabin at 2 a.m. The second showed Linda herself, clad in dark attire, pulling up the property markers I had placed to delineate the boundaries. However, the third piece of footage was the most incriminating. Linda was seen meeting with a man I did not know, giving him what appeared to be cash, and gesturing towards my cabin. I did not contact the police. Not at that point. Instead, I provided the footage to the HOA's attorney as evidence of ongoing harassment. I left it to him to sort out the legal ramifications. The aroma of evening campfire smoke wafted across the water as I installed motion-activated floodlights around the cabin's perimeter. The distant calls of loons created a serene soundtrack for my security measures. While the taste of impending justice felt sweeter than my morning coffee, my circle of allies was expanding as well. Earl connected me with other pre-HOA property owners who had their own stories about Linda. The local fishing guide began directing clients to me for lake access. Even the county inspector had turned into an informal supporter after noticing Linda's pattern of filing false reports. She's filed 17 complaints in 2 years, he told me confidentially. 16 of them were unfounded. We're beginning to flag her calls. Linda's public relations efforts grew more frantic by the day. She arranged a community safety meeting to discuss transient cabin dwellers. Apparently, I was now considered a transient, despite owning the property. She reached out to a friend from her book club at the local newspaper, weaving stories about suspicious activities and a decline in neighborhood safety. The posts on Nextdoor were particularly imaginative. According to Linda's version of events, I was simultaneously operating a business without the necessary permits, using dangerous equipment at all hours, entertaining unsavory individuals, and somehow endangering the well-being of children simply by my presence. She even tried to coerce the marina into revoking my boat launch access, asserting that I was fostering a hostile environment for families. Here's a security tip I learned the hard way. Security cameras on your own property can legally document harassment and trespassing. Keep footage organized with timestamps for potential legal use. Throughout all of this, I practiced what my grandfather would have called strategic patience. I persisted with the cabin restoration, documenting each phase. I cultivated relationships with reasonable members of the community. I allowed Linda to overextend herself while I compiled my evidence. The sensation of smooth river rocks beneath my boots as I reconstructed Grandpa's pathway. The sound of my tools working diligently while Linda's schemes became more frenzied. The taste of determination blended with the morning lake mist. Everything was converging towards a confrontation that I could see approaching like a storm front over the water. But Linda had no inkling of what she was truly up against. Because while she was engrossed in her petty power struggles, I was unearthing secrets that were about to change everything. The real bombshell was still secured in Grandpa's crawl space, awaiting its moment. The breakthrough occurred on a rainy Saturday morning as I was insulating the cabin's crawl space. I had been delaying this particular task because, on my list of preferred activities, crawl spaces fall somewhere between root canals and tax audits. Lying on my back with a flashlight in one hand and insulation in the other, my elbow bumped against something metallic wedged between two floor joists. After some effort, I managed to free a second metal box, smaller than the first but just as meticulously preserved. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth like some kind of buried treasure, was a document that caused me to sit up so abruptly I almost hit my head on a beam. The original 1994 sale contract between my grandfather and Clearwater Development Corporation. But this was no ordinary contract. It was the master agreement, containing clauses I had never seen. My hands were genuinely trembling as I read through the legal text, and it wasn't due to the chill of the crawl space. Grandpa hadn't merely retained ownership of the dock. He had retained approval authority over every single water permit for the entire lake. Every boat dock, every seawall, every water-related structure within the HOA development required written consent from the designated representative of the Morrison family. That representative was me. Linda and her neighbors had been conducting their affairs under fraudulent permits for 3 decades. I emerged from that crawl space and sat at Grandpa's old kitchen table, reading the contract repeatedly as rain hammered on the tin roof. The implications were staggering. Grandpa had essentially established a legal safeguard to curb overdevelopment of the lake, cleverly disguised as a straightforward property sale. The following morning, I went directly to my attorney's office. "This is extraordinary leverage," he remarked after examining the documents for 20 minutes. "You could legally revoke all dock privileges right now. Every property sale that needs dock access would require your approval. You could impose market rate fees for dock usage. We are talking a minimum of $4,000 per month per slip." He performed some brief calculations. "A conservative estimate, your approval rights are worth over $2 million to this community. But here's the thing. Taking such drastic action would harm innocent homeowners who had purchased their properties in good faith, elderly retirees who had saved their entire lives for a lakefront retirement, and young families who simply desired a safe environment for their children. That wouldn't be justice. It would just be vengeance." That evening, I sat on the dock watching the sunset paint the water in shades of gold and orange, grappling with the scale of what my grandfather had accomplished. He had safeguarded this lake through legal ingenuity, not out of spite. He had endowed his descendants with the means to protect what was important without demolishing what was good. The loons called across the water, their cries echoing off the hills just as they had for generations. long before the McMansions, the HOA, and Linda's petty power struggles. This was about something more significant than dock fees, property values, or community standards. This was about stewardship. I made my choice sitting there, my coffee growing cold as the stars began to emerge. I would use this leverage to achieve a reasonable solution, not for financial enrichment. I would aim for Linda's resignation, the establishment of peaceful coexistence, and the protection of the lake for generations to come. The power dynamic had been completely upended. Linda's entire authority was founded on illegally collected fees and fraudulent permits. The community's property values were, in fact, reliant on my goodwill, not her intimidation. But she was not yet aware of that. Here is something every waterfront property buyer should know. Original property developers sometimes include hidden control mechanisms. A thorough review of all historical documents before purchasing is essential. The next stage would demand meticulous planning, reliable allies, and impeccable timing. Because when you possess what amounts to a legal nuclear weapon, the most challenging part isn't deploying it, it's deploying it judiciously. The planning stage demanded the sort of systematic preparation that would impress a military strategist. I was not merely constructing a legal argument. I was orchestrating a complete overhaul of a community's power hierarchy. Earl took on the role of my unofficial campaign manager, visiting each evening with intelligence gathered from the old-timer network. It turns out that when you have lived in a place for 50 years, you know where all the secrets are hidden. Linda secured a home equity loan last year using her dock permit as collateral. He informed me over coffee one morning, settling into what had become his customary chair on my porch. The bank demanded proof of permanent water access for the loan's approval. That was leverage I could employ. The marina owner, Dave, offered inside information on irregularities with the dock permits. He had been maintaining records of payments, and Linda's accounting was, to be charitable, creative. Some residents paid her directly, others via the HOA, and no one was clear on who actually owned what. My acquaintance at the county inspector's office, whom we'll call Mike, provided off-the-record details about Linda's history of violations. 90% of her complaints had been without merit, and she had begun to be flagged by multiple agencies as a source of frequent complaints. We are obligated to look into every report, Mike explained. But unofficially, when her name appears on a complaint, we tend to roll our eyes first. My attorney put together a comprehensive response package that would have made the Supreme Court take notice. Every threat Linda had issued, every false accusation she had made, every act of harassment, all were documented with legal exactitude and supported by irrefutable historical evidence. The settlement offer was elegantly straightforward. I would issue permanent dock easements to all current residents in return for formal acknowledgement of my cabin's protected status and Linda's immediate resignation from any position of authority regarding lake matters. The financial breakdown was astonishing. Linda's HOA had amassed approximately $1.8 million in illicit dock fees over the last 5 years. In the current market, comparable lake access rights were selling for $500,000 and more. By a conservative estimate, my approval rights were valued at over $2 million to the community. But my interest was not in the money, it was in the principle. Local fishing guides came together to provide testimony on the cabin's historical significance and minimal environmental footprint. These were men who had been guiding clients on this lake for decades, who recalled a time when it was about fishing and tranquility rather than property values and social standing. The technical groundwork was akin to preparing for a doctoral dissertation. I arranged all documents chronologically in professional binders, developed a visual timeline of the property's history that any non-expert could grasp, and compiled environmental impact assessments demonstrating that the cabin's footprint was smaller than that of most community garages. I documented every case of Linda's harassment with timestamps, witnesses, and photographic proof. The pattern was unmistakable. Escalating intimidation aimed at forcing me out through legal expenses and community pressure. The psychological preparation was equally crucial. I rehearsed a calm, factual delivery in front of the mirror, anticipating Linda's likely emotional reactions and personal attacks. I knew she would attempt to frame the issue around class, outsiders, or anything other than the legal facts. Late into the night, sitting in my grandfather's old leather chair, with the lingering scent of wood polish and decades of pipe tobacco still in the fabric, I would study contracts and practice my answers to common HOA arguments. The rustling of papers blended with the distant calls of night birds on the lake. My timing strategy was vital. I would wait for Linda to convene another emergency meeting. As her pattern indicated, she couldn't resist a dramatic move. I planned to attend as a regular community member, allow her to present her case, and then methodically refute every assertion with documented evidence. The community benefit planning was the final piece of the puzzle. Using the dock fees Linda had been wrongfully collecting, I drafted a proposal for a lake conservation fund that would serve everyone. Annual water quality monitoring, removal of invasive species, and a scholarship program for local students pursuing environmental science. I even drafted plans for dock enhancements that would benefit the entire community while respecting my grandfather's conservationist goals, featuring modern materials, eco-friendly design, and improved accessibility for elderly residents. Here are the key takeaways that could assist anyone in a similar situation. Property research at the county courthouse often uncovers hidden easements and rights that predate modern developments. Preserve important documents in fireproof, waterproof containers, as historical papers can become legal game changers. Regarding legal leverage, sometimes the best defense is realizing you don't need to defend yourself at all because you actually hold all the cards. The taste of morning coffee combined with the fulfillment of thorough preparation. The feel of organized documents in my hands. The sound of a plan converging like the steady beat of waves on the shore. I was prepared for whatever Linda had in store next. Because when you possess both the moral high ground and legal supremacy, patience becomes your most powerful asset. Linda's desperation escalated dramatically when she learned I had been consulting with an attorney. Her network of informants among the old-timers was not as reliable as she believed, but word eventually reached her that I was no longer just on the defensive. Her reaction was immediate and extreme. She convened an emergency HOA board meeting to approve a $100,000 legal defense fund. This money was to be sourced from a special assessment that would require each homeowner to contribute $3,000 for what she termed community protection against frivolous litigation. The panic she instigated was a masterclass in manipulation. That cabin owner could decimate all our property values. She warned anyone who would listen. We must present a united front before he bankrupts us all with lawsuits. That same week, 3 homeowners received notices demanding immediate payment, accompanied by threats of placing liens on their properties if they did not comply. It was at this point that Linda crossed a line from which there was no return. Meanwhile, my security cameras were capturing conduct that would make a criminal defense attorney's mouth water. First, there was Linda's landscaper, a man I later discovered she paid in cash, illegally dumping yard waste and construction debris near my cabin in the dead of night. The footage was perfectly clear, license plate, face, everything. When I contacted the landscaper the next day, he quickly implicated Linda. The lady paid me $200 to make it look like your property was attracting refuse, he confessed. Said it was for insurance. Then began the campaign of bureaucratic harassment. A flood of mysterious complaints started pouring into every conceivable agency: the health department, fire department, zoning, and environmental protection. Each complaint necessitated an inspection, which cost me both time and money. And every single inspector found nothing amiss. The pattern became so glaring that even the government employees started to get irritated. Same handwriting on all the complaints. One inspector commented, showing me 3 different forms allegedly from 3 different residents. Linda even succeeded in getting my boat launch access temporarily suspended by putting pressure on the marina owner. She asserted that I was creating a hostile environment for families and threatened to orchestrate a boycott of his establishment if he failed to cooperate. But Linda's most significant error was escalating to sabotage. My cameras captured her teenage son once again, this time with 2 friends, as they tried to sever the dock lines on my fishing boat. Even more incriminating was the footage of Linda herself at 11 p.m. on a Tuesday, removing the property markers I had installed following a survey. The most damning evidence showed Linda meeting with an unfamiliar man, handing him what was unmistakably cash, and pointing toward my cabin while making gestures that appeared distinctly menacing. I did not immediately contact the police. Instead, I presented the footage to the HOA attorney as further proof of escalating harassment. His face turned white when he witnessed Linda caught in the act of destroying property markers. "Mr. Morrison, I must strongly urge my client to cease all interaction with you and your property." But Linda was past heeding legal counsel. She had arrived at that point where pride and panic eclipsed common sense. She organized what she termed a community safety patrol, essentially a group of volunteers who shadowed me on my fishing trips, taking intrusive photographs and documenting my suspicious activities such as fishing, performing dock maintenance, and enjoying my morning coffee on my own porch. The harassment became so overt that she actually filed for a restraining order, alleging that I had threatened her during an encounter at the grocery store. The problem for her was that my phone had recorded our entire exchange, which proved that our interaction consisted of me saying, "Good morning, Linda," and her launching into a 5-minute tirade about property values. The judge not only dismissed her request for a restraining order, but also issued a warning about filing false reports. Here is something every property owner should know. Document all incidents of harassment with timestamps and witnesses. A pattern of false reporting can have legal repercussions for the person making the claims. The community began to split along predictable lines. 3 HOA board members quietly stepped down rather than endorse Linda's increasingly erratic campaign. Several homeowners declined to pay the special assessment without seeing any real legal basis for it. Earl's intelligence network informed me that Linda's husband was advising her to take a vacation until the situation settled down. Apparently, his bank was growing uneasy with the negative press surrounding his wife's crusade. The sound of my power tools during the evening cabin restoration had become a form of meditation, steady, purposeful, and relentless. The scent of fresh pine boards replacing decaying siding mixed with the taste of inevitable justice on the crisp autumn air. But Linda was not finished. Her final escalation was imminent, and I could feel it gathering like a storm front across the water. When people like Linda sense they are losing their grip on power, they do not back down gracefully. They double down one last time, often with dramatic consequences. I was prepared for whatever was to come. My documentation was exhaustive, my legal standing was unassailable, and my patience was on the verge of yielding results Linda could not fathom. The only remaining question was whether she would self-destruct before I had to reveal the hand I was holding. Linda's final desperate moves were like watching someone pour gasoline on a fire while standing perilously close to the flames. It began with an attempt at bribery, actual, honest-to-goodness bribery. My friend at the county inspector's office, Mike, called me personally to inform me that Linda had approached him after a community function, offering what she termed a consulting fee if he could discover code violations at my cabin. She pulled out an envelope filled with cash. "Jake," right there in the parking lot of the Methodist church, said it was for thorough inspection services. Mike reported the incident to the county ethics office that very afternoon. Next, Linda attempted to buy off the marina owner, Dave, with an exclusive HOA contract valued at $50,000 a year if he would permanently prohibit me from using the boat launch. Dave recorded the entire conversation on his phone and played it for me over coffee later that evening. She actually said, "We need to make his life so difficult that he just gives up and leaves," Dave recounted with a chuckle, shaking his head. The lady doesn't grasp that such an act constitutes a legal conspiracy. But Linda's desperation reached its zenith when she contacted an environmental group with fabricated allegations about me polluting the lake with illegal runoff. She manipulated photos to make my restoration materials appear like industrial waste and submitted them to 3 separate agencies. The investigators from the environmental group arrived, expecting to find an ecological catastrophe. Instead, they found that Linda's own property was rife with violations: fertilizer runoff, non-native landscaping extending right to the water's edge, and a decorative fountain that was illegally drawing water from the lake without the required permits. The campaign of intimidation widened to include anyone who had offered me support. Linda began to threaten neighbors who had been cordial to me with HOA violations for trivial issues like mailbox positioning, garden edging, and even the color of their front doors. This strategy backfired spectacularly. Nothing alienates reasonable people from a tyrant more quickly than witnessing them abuse their authority against innocent individuals. My network of anonymous supporters grew in direct response to Linda's overreach. Someone began leaving fresh vegetables from their garden on my cabin porch each morning. Another unidentified supporter paid my marina fees after Linda had them canceled through coercive tactics. The owner of the hardware store quietly upgraded my material orders at no additional cost. Most of us are on your side. Read an unsigned note tucked under my windshield wiper. Don't let her win. Linda's public conduct was becoming increasingly erratic. Earl observed her having a screaming argument with an HOA board member at the post office about traitors undermining community security. She threatened to sue the local newspaper for biased reporting, even though they had only published verified facts. Her husband's quiet suggestion that she take a vacation grew louder and more insistent as Linda's crusade began to draw unwanted scrutiny from his bank's board of directors. The momentum of the investigations was now beyond Linda's influence. The newspaper's research had exposed systemic permit irregularities throughout the entire HOA. The county launched an audit of all of Linda's filed complaints, discovering that 90% were baseless. The state environmental agency initiated a formal investigation into Linda for repeated false reporting. Even the sheriff's department had flagged Linda's address as a source of frequent complaints after she had contacted them 17 times in 2 months about various suspicious activities that were all perfectly legal. My final preparations were methodical and thorough. Every document was meticulously organized in professional binders. Every instance of harassment was documented with timestamps and witnesses. My security system was enhanced with live streaming capabilities for both protection and evidence preservation. My attorney confirmed that our documentation package was court-ready and airtight. My community allies were ready to provide testimony about Linda's patterns of harassment if necessary. Contacts with local media were established for coverage after the revelations. But the most crucial preparation was psychological. I sat on my grandfather's dock in the evenings, watching the sunset cast shades of gold and crimson across the water, contemplating the responsibility that came with the power I now possessed. The taste of autumn air mingled with the scent of wood smoke from a nearby fireplace. The sound of geese honking overhead as they migrated south for the winter. The feel of solid dock planks beneath my feet, planks that I now knew belonged to me, not the HOA. Linda was orchestrating her own downfall with surgical precision. The perfect storm was gathering as she called for one final, emergency HOA meeting to resolve the cabin situation permanently. She pledged to unveil shocking truths about my illegal occupation and called for a community vote to employ all legal means necessary to oust me from the lake. She had invited city councilmen, a county commissioner, and the local press, promising a presentation that would expose this threat to our community once and for all. Here's the legal insight that protected me. Filing false reports with government agencies can lead to criminal charges and civil liability. Always confirm your facts before submitting official complaints. Linda was about to learn that lesson the hard way, in front of everyone who mattered. The community center was filled beyond its capacity that Thursday night. More than 100 residents occupied every chair, stood along the walls, and spilled out into the hallway. The atmosphere was heavy with tension and the nervous anticipation of people sensing they were on the verge of witnessing something momentous. Linda made her entrance in full combat attire, a designer navy suit that likely cost more than my monthly mortgage payment, immaculately coiffed, and the self-assurance of someone convinced they were about to land a decisive blow. She came equipped with visual aids, an easel with poster boards, a laptop for her presentation, and a stack of documents thick enough to serve as a doorstop. The local newspaper reporter and her photographer were seated in the front row. County Commissioner Sarah Rodriguez had driven in from the county seat. City Councilman Bradley Walsh, Linda's tennis partner, looked uneasy but was present. Even a few individuals from neighboring lake communities had appeared, drawn by the small-town rumor mill. I arrived early and chose a seat in the back, carrying only a single manila folder and the quiet confidence that comes from holding a winning hand. Linda ascended to the podium as if she were accepting an Academy Award. Ladies and gentlemen, tonight we are going to address a threat that has been looming over our community for months. This illegal cabin operation has persisted for too long. Her PowerPoint presentation was a masterwork of manipulation, featuring charts that depicted declining property values, photos of my cabin taken from angles that made it resemble a condemned building, and dramatic quotations about community standards and protecting our investments. Mr. Morrison's so-called cabin is in violation of dozens of current regulations and jeopardizes everyone's property values. Tonight, I am requesting your approval to initiate immediate legal action to remove this blight from our lake. The crowd murmured in agreement, and several residents expressed concerns about my aggressive tactics and refusal to cooperate with community standards. Linda's supporters were outspoken and confident. From the middle section, Earl rose to his feet. "Now hold on, Linda. Jake's grandfather constructed that cabin before any of us were even considering this lake. A little respect for history might be appropriate." "History does not supersede property law, Earl," Linda retorted sharply. "We reside in a modern community with modern standards." It was then that County Commissioner Rodriguez posed the question that changed the course of the evening. "Mr. Morrison, would you care to respond to these allegations?" I stood up slowly, manila folder in hand, and walked to the front. The room grew quiet as I neared the podium. You could hear the low hum of the fluorescent lights and someone's anxious breathing in the front row. "Thank you, Commissioner Rodriguez. I appreciate the chance to clear up some misunderstandings." I opened my folder and took out a single document. The original 1994 development contract. I have recently come across some interesting historical documents that I believe everyone here should be aware of. Linda's face turned ashen as I laid the contract on the podium and adjusted the microphone. "This is the original development agreement between my grandfather and Clearwater Development Corporation, dated March 15, 1994. It includes some provisions that may come as a surprise to some." I read the critical clause slowly and distinctly. "The Morrison family's designated representative retains ownership and approval authority over all lake access structures, including but not limited to docks, boat slips, and water permits within the development's boundaries." The silence was absolute. "What this means," I went on, "is that every dock permit in this community has been technically invalid for the past 30 years. Every boat slip rental, every dock fee, every right to water access. All of it necessitates written approval from the Morrison family's designated representative." "That would be me." Linda shot up from her chair. "Those are fake documents. This is fraud. Commissioner, you must arrest this man immediately." Commissioner Rodriguez inspected the contract with the meticulous scrutiny of someone experienced with legal paperwork. "Mr. Morrison, this document appears to be authentic. These seals and signatures seem legitimate." "They are legitimate," I stated calmly. "I am not here to cause harm to anyone or to take anything away from this community. In fact, I have drafted an easement agreement that would grant permanent dock rights to all current residents." I produced the pre-written agreement. "My only condition is peaceful coexistence and a cessation of the harassment I have been subjected to. I would also like to propose that the dock fees currently being collected be redirected to a community lake conservation fund." Linda's subsequent breakdown was a sight to behold. She yelled accusations at me, at the commissioner, at the reporter, and even at her own allies. "This is a conspiracy. He forged those papers. Someone paid him to ruin our community." Security had to escort her from the room as she continued to rave about lawsuits, fraud, and how people like him did not belong in communities like ours. Her husband trailed behind her, offering apologies to everyone he passed. The community's response was swift and overwhelmingly positive. Residents formed a line to shake my hand and express their remorse for Linda's actions. The HOA board members began discussing her immediate resignation. The reporter interviewed me about my remarkable self-control and generous proposal. "I am just seeking healing and cooperation," I told her, "not retribution." The aftermath unfolded more quickly than a Michigan spring thaw. Linda's resignation from the HOA board was accepted unanimously at an emergency meeting convened 3 days later. The new board president, a retired teacher named Margaret Shun, issued a public apology to both me and the community for what she described as months of unnecessary conflict and harassment. Within a week, I had executed permanent easement agreements for every dock slip in the development. The illegal dock fees, approximately $1.8 million that Linda had collected over the years, were transferred to the newly created Lake Clearwater Conservation Fund. Finally, something constructive emerged from all the turmoil. Linda's repercussions continued to accumulate like compound interest. The county ethics investigation led to a $5,000 fine for the attempted bribery of a public official. She was compelled to cover my attorney's fees, amounting to $12,000, as part of the harassment settlement. Her husband's bank discreetly reassigned him to a branch 2 counties away to distance themselves from the scandal. Their house was listed for sale within 6 months, and a sold sign appeared sooner than anyone had anticipated. It seems that when you create that many adversaries in a small community, a fresh start becomes an appealing prospect. But this story is not primarily about Linda's downfall. It is about what followed. The first annual Grandfather Morrison Lake Cleanup Day attracted over 50 volunteers. We cleared out invasive species, restored native shoreline vegetation, and put up educational signs about preserving the lake's ecosystem. The Conservation Fund covered all expenses, and the sense of community pride was almost palpable in the crisp morning air. Our fishing tournament raised $8,000 for a veteran's mental health program, an initiative my grandfather, a veteran himself, would have deeply appreciated. Local businesses contributed prizes, and even some of Linda's former supporters pitched in to help with the barbecue. My cabin restoration transformed into a symbol of what can be achieved when you respect history while building for the future. I finished the project using sustainable materials and traditional methods, creating a retreat that feels as if it has always been a part of the lake. The aroma of cedar and pine, the call of loons at sunrise, the feel of solid craftsmanship beneath my hands. It was precisely as my grandfather had envisioned. The conservation work garnered attention at the state level. Our water quality testing program received an Environmental Stewardship Award, and the lake became a benchmark for community-driven preservation initiatives. Other waterfront communities began to seek my guidance on how to balance development with environmental protection. On a personal note, the experience taught me an unforeseen lesson about healing. My ex-wife contacted me after reading about the events in the newspaper, impressed by my dignified handling of the conflict. We are not reuniting, but we are communicating again, which is significant for our family. My grandson finally received the fishing lesson I had promised him. Watching him make his first cast from the very same dock where 4 generations of Morrison men had learned the same skill, that single moment made every second of Linda's harassment worthwhile. The taste of victory, flavored with family tradition, was far sweeter than any form of revenge. The Morrison Family Scholarship now awards $2,500 annually to local students who are pursuing degrees in environmental science. 3 students have received it to date, and their letters of thanks are displayed proudly on my kitchen table next to my grandfather's old coffee mug. Property values in the community have actually risen since the legal ambiguity was cleared up. Several properties were purchased by buyers specifically drawn to our conservation leadership and cooperative spirit. The marina's business increased by 15%, fueled by positive media coverage and referrals from fishing guides. Sometimes, I sit on that dock as the sun sets, watching the water turn to gold and feeling my grandfather's spirit in the evening breeze. I have come to understand that defending your principles does more than just protect your own rights. It can fortify an entire community when people witness that bullies do not always have to win. The old-timers still visit for coffee and conversation. Earl has become something of a local figure, always prepared to share the story of how patience and preparation triumphed over bluster and intimidation. But here is the part that brings a smile to my face. Last month, a waterfront property owner from the adjacent county got in touch with me about an HOA conflict that sounds strikingly similar. It appears their board president has been collecting fees for permits she does not actually possess. Some people never seem to learn.